Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 3, Episode 41. Cromwell's Spies. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome our new members to the Patreon House of Lords: Earl Dan Jenkins, Earl Coniah Wimmock-Tannen, Earl Sam Kittle, Earl David Golden, and Earl Rabenkopf. If you'd like to join their ranks and listen to the podcast ad-free, then go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica. Thank you to all my patrons for helping keep this show on the road. Last time, we saw the Commonwealth successfully conquer the island of Jamaica from the Spanish. Sort of. While forcing the surrender of the colony's leadership, General Robert Venables was unable to prevent the vast majority of the existing population from fleeing into the mountains, from where they will fight a guerrilla campaign against the English for many years. We will leave them there for now, and follow Venables and his fellow commissioner, Admiral William Penn, back to England. Deciding that there was nothing more that they could do, they left the bulk of their forces behind to face a tropical meat grinder which killed thousands of soldiers and settlers. When they returned to London, they did their best to present the conquest of Jamaica in the best possible light, but Lord Protector Cromwell was not convinced. The reason Cromwell knew so much about the conquest of Jamaica and the failures at Hispaniola was largely because of the efforts of one man, John Thurloe, the Protectorate's unofficial spymaster. Unofficially, because there was no official intelligence service, and Thurloe's position on paper was Secretary of State. But in reality, the Secretary of State in early modern England was normally responsible for handling both domestic and foreign intelligence gathering. Thurloe had been behind the scenes for the last decade or so. He was one of the parliamentary commissioners negotiating with Charles at Uxbridge in 1644, and he'd been part of the diplomatic mission to the Netherlands in 1651, neither of which had gone particularly well. But in 1652, Thurloe became Secretary of State, which he would hold for nearly the rest of the decade. Thurloe was, in the words of David Underdown, a genius in this role, and at least part of his reputation comes from how well he managed the resources at his command. The most important resource, the sinew of espionage, was money. Samuel Pepys, of diary fame, claimed that Thurloe's budget was £70,000 a year, which is a truly insane amount of money. Historians have settled on a much more reasonable estimate of around £3,000 a year, which would have represented about 0.1% of the annual budget of the state. Timothy Peacock compares this with the annual budget of the UK intelligence services in 2017, which comes to about 0.32%, or £2.6 billion. Peacock points out that Thurloe's budget wouldn't have been limited to what was officially ring-fenced for intelligence expenses. From 1655, Thurloe also ran the post office. Not only was this a great source of intelligence, he was reading everyone's mail, but the proceeds of the postal service could go back into intelligence gathering. Peacock also suggests that the revenue of several state-backed news sheets went into intelligence too. Ad hoc methods were employed when and where possible, and, unsurprisingly, since we're talking about spies, it's safe to assume that many things went unrecorded. Thurloe made excellent use of the money he did have, and he was stingy with his budget. If an informer's info wasn't reliable or didn't have enough detail, Thurloe wouldn't hesitate to deny them payment or just cut them loose. Thurloe himself received a salary of about £800, which was far from extravagant, but it's also likely he skimmed every so often. He was, after all, a government minister. Of course, Thurloe wasn't working alone. Much like other famous spymasters like Francis Walsingham, Thurloe became the name and face for the whole intelligence-gathering network, a sort of shorthand for historians when we can't refer to instituted agencies or departments. But there were people around him, like genius mathematicians and analysts who became very effective at breaking royalist codes. But also clerks, secretaries, messengers, soldiers, who all put in the work of managing and responding to intelligence, but all of whom will have had other responsibilities. Exact numbers are unclear, but between 12 and 50 people at various times. And through these and the state apparatus, Thurloe could act across the Commonwealth, which he very much did. Thurloe was proactive in chasing down conspiracies and plots against the Protectorate and the Lord Protector himself. We'll talk about a couple of them in a moment. Thurloe became indispensable to the government. When he was ill, ambassadors wrote home complaining that they couldn't get anything done, they couldn't meet with Cromwell, and that the government ground to a halt. The Lord Deputies of Ireland, first Charles Fleetwood and then Henry Cromwell, relied on Thurloe to keep them updated on events in London. His importance was known publicly, and sometimes mocked in satire. One of these satires, A Game of Piquet, depicts various members of the Cromwellian government playing the card game, with Thurloe standing behind Cromwell's chair, shuffling the cards. He was undoubtedly important to the Cromwellian regime, but it is important, as Paul Lay has noted, not to imagine Thurloe at the head of a police state. But, as Cromwell's spymaster, the security of the state was his highest priority, and in the Protectorate, that also meant the security of the Lord Protector himself. Contemporaries, regardless of their politics or sympathies, saw quite clearly that the figure of Oliver Cromwell was the linchpin of this whole experiment of government. His death or incapacity would threaten the survival of the Protectorate project, and there were many hoping to speed up that inevitable fate. Royalists within and out with the Commonwealth hoped, prayed, and plotted for Cromwell's death. And in a way, Thurloe was the first line of defence against daggers in the dark. One of these plots was the Gerard Plot, which emerged in the early months of 1654. Its origins involve Prince Rupert, who at this point was back in Europe after his campaign of piracy, and who was still at the exiled Stuart court in Paris, though not in Charles's good books. Rupert's faction had been approached by a coven of 3 men: Thomas Henshaw, a former parliamentary spy who had since defected to the royalist cause, Henshaw's half-brother, John Wisemas, and John Fitzjames, a former colonel in the parliamentary army who had also deserted. These 3 men had a straightforward goal: to kill Oliver Cromwell. They were soon joined by the man who gives his name to the affair, John Gerard. They then travelled from Paris to London undercover. Now, undercover didn't mean safe, and Fitzjames drowned on the journey. But the 2 half-brothers and Gerard did make it to London, where they took an unorthodox approach to espionage. They put out an advert: "Help wanted, 1 assassin, pay £500. Now, the job market being what it always is, they did get some interest in the position. At least one potential hire turned them down after finding out who he was meant to kill, and warned the 2 men not to meddle in state matters. But still, the conspiracy grew. They met on the 13th of May, 1654, to hash out the details, and from what we can tell, there's more than a dash of optimism in this plot. They would strike when the Lord Protector set off for his regular weekend stay at Hampton Court Palace. Henshaw and Gerard were going to lead 700 men in an attack on Cromwell's personal guard. Now, where exactly these hundreds of people would come from, I don't know. They would wait for Cromwell's entourage at Whitehall, while 2 of Gerard's relatives would incite an uprising of London's apprentices near the Old Bailey. This plan was scuppered by Cromwell himself, who, instead of taking a carriage to Hampton Court, went by boat up the Thames. The plotters settled on a new approach. They would attack Cromwell when they knew exactly where he'd be: on a Sunday in Whitehall Chapel. A week after the failed first attempt, the conspirators set out from their safe houses, bound for Whitehall. At which point they were detained by Thurloe's agents. Thurloe had known about the plot since at least February, when a royalist agent had been questioned, and revealed that there was a design on the Protector's life. And not just Cromwell, John Lambert and Thurloe himself were to be killed too, to better sink the Protectorate ship of state. So, the spymaster had been on the lookout for the conspirators, many of whom had been identified already, and so when Henshaw and Wisemas got to London and began fishing for support, Thurloe began tracking them down. In the initial roundup, Gerard and 5 others were caught. Since Gerard, related to a baron, was the most high-profile of these early catches, he gave his name to the plot. But this first roundup was just the start. Other suspects and known royalists were swept up in raids too, and around 40 were questioned in the following days. This included members of the Sealed Knot, a royalist secret society who planned and supported multiple plots to restore the Stuarts, but who didn't really have much to do with the Gerard plot. One of those swept up, Sir Richard Willis, believed he had been betrayed by a rival in the Stuart court, and so he switched sides in return for his freedom, becoming a double agent for the Protectorate regime. Thurloe took a personal interest in the questioning of the Gerard plotters, which makes sense. He'd been marked for death by them, and he took that personally. Paul Lay describes Thurloe as uncharacteristically enraged, and he notes how the spymaster described the conspirators as the scum and feces of that party. But, despite this now being personal, the Protectorate wasn't bloodthirsty. Gerard and another conspirator were executed, and 3 others were transported to Barbados, and that was it. Henshaw escaped back to France, and told everyone who would listen that the failure of the plot wasn't his fault. It had been a trap laid by the Protectorate. Now this doesn't appear to have been true, except in that the Protectorate gave the plotters enough rope to hang themselves with. The Gerard plotters had been overly optimistic and trigger-happy, and Thurloe's network would have probably caught on to them even on a bad day. That they had sparked a roundup of more cautious royalists would be much more damaging to the cause. As with Willis, the Protectorate court was very capable at turning royalist agents once they caught them, and the court in exile was riddled with spies and double agents who had been banished by their new masters. One of those was Joseph Bampfield. He was as close to a professional spy as we can find in this period. He started spying on Parliament for Charles I in 1644, and after the Second Civil War, it was Bampfield who smuggled Prince James out of England. After the regicide, Bampfield was arrested, but himself escaped the country, fleeing to the Netherlands. But by 1652, he was back in the Commonwealth, where he was arrested once again, and this time he was turned. With Bampfield now in the Republic's pocket, he was banished and sent back to the exiled Stuarts, who welcomed him back with open arms, before sending him on to Scotland. There were those at court who were suspicious of the spy, including Edward Hyde, but the court in exile was a house of vipers, a house divided. Factions ran rampant, and because Hyde thought the worst of Bampfield, those who disliked Hyde thought Bampfield must be a good egg, including, damningly for their cause, highly placed members of the Sealed Knot. Bampfield continued to send reports to Thurloe, written in lemon juice, and he even turned other members of the court. The fallout of the Gerard plot spooked the rest of the Sealed Knot. Even those who hadn't been caught up in the raids now had a recent example of how effective the Protectorate state could be. The Sealed Knot withdrew, retreated, became even more cautious and passive. But that secret society didn't encompass everyone who hoped to see a Stuart restoration, and by backing away, the Sealed Knot left open a vacuum. A new council formed, eager to tear down the Protectorate, restore the good old cause, and see the Stuarts back on the throne. Yes, you heard that right. From the summer of 1654, royalist agents began to feel out all critics of Cromwell's regime, and by this point there were a lot. There were traditional royalists, of course, but also former parliamentarians of many different shades. Presbyterians appalled by the regicide, as well as the toleration of the Protectorate. Fifth monarchists, who were outraged at how the Protectorate had swept aside the world's best chance at heaven on earth. Commonwealth's men, who were disgusted that Cromwell had betrayed the good old cause to become a king in all but name. The Protectorate had alienated many factions, and now balanced on a precariously narrow support base. The army and more moderate independents, with the acquiescence of the vast majority of people who just wanted to live their lives, and who might not be thrilled with the current government, but weren't going to cause it any trouble. Prince, and one day King, Charles, hoped to bind all of those opposing groups together into one big happy family which would work to put him back on his thrones. Never mind that most of them hated each other and wanted mutually exclusive things, and were united only by their dislike of the current ruling regime. One of the men involved in this planning was the former governor of Barbados, Lord Willoughby. Remember him? He'd held out against the state's navy, only to be forced from power by a mutiny. He'd been pretty well treated by the Commonwealth, all things considered, who took him home and restored his English properties, but he was still an advocate for the Stuarts. He wrote to Charles often, and even promised that the towering figure of Sir Thomas Fairfax was on their side. Now this would be an incredible asset. If Fairfax came out of retirement and publicly backed a restoration, the army would surely be split in their loyalties between their current and former commander-in-chief. Charles was enthusiastic about this possibility, and he wrote to Fairfax through various family members. When he didn't get a response, he tried again, and again. Leigh sums up his attempts to woo Fairfax as becoming a little bit desperate. More sceptical voices at court, like Hyde and the exiled Marquis of Ormond, urged their king to see reality. Fairfax wasn't going to join a conspiracy, at least not yet. And as 1654 became 1655, other former conspirators stopped replying to the exiled court, as the more sensible or cautious amongst them judged their chances to be slim. This included Willoughby, who missed several rendezvous. But again, as the cautious ones backed away, the hotheads remained, and this included Commonwealth's men and levellers like Richard Overton. Overton planned to take over the army in Scotland, after imprisoning George Monk somehow, and then march his army south to join up with other radicals. Monk, of course, found out about this and arrested him first, and Overton would sit in jail for 4 years. Fifth monarchists like Major General Thomas Harrison were invited to meet with Cromwell, where they were offered a pretty generous deal. Stop mobilising against the state and live your life. Harrison rejected the offer and was placed under effective house arrest. Cromwell had him released and again told him to, quote, "not to persist in these deceitful ways whose end is destruction." But of course, Harrison persisted in those deceitful ways, and in February 1655 he was arrested and sent to Carisbrooke Castle. Despite the hopes of Royalists and Commonwealth's men, the army was not going to turn on the state. Thurloe himself reported his opinion, quote, "So far from the army falling into the hands of such men as these are, there is no question, but they will live and die to maintain the government as it is now settled." But the plotting continued into 1655, and the new council plans were laid for a massive royalist uprising. The exiled prince was informed that insurrections would erupt in Hull, Newcastle, Carlisle, Shrewsbury, Ludlow, Nottingham, Warwick, Dover, and in the West Country. Leaders of these cities and regions had already been appointed and were ready to act. Charles, of course, loved what he heard and sent his approval for the plan. A few days later, the court received a message from the Sealed Knot, who were not behind this plot and were very clear they didn't support it. They didn't think it was going to work, and no uprising was better for a royalist future than a bad uprising. Ormond, in Antwerp, but with his ear to the ground, wrote directly to his king and gave him the choice: either tell the Sealed Knot to back the plan or call it off. Charles could not bring himself to abandon his hope in the plan, but neither would he order the secret society to join it when they clearly did not support it. And so, with the half-hearted support of the court in exile, the royalists prepared for an uprising. But the thing is, the Protectorate was preparing too. Thurloe had been informed by his spies that something was in the works, and he reacted as quickly as an early modern state could. English garrisons had been drained to supply the campaign in Scotland, as well as the Western Design, and transfer orders were made to bring 2,000 men from Ireland to Liverpool, from where they were dispersed. The garrison of the Tower of London was tripled from 400 men to 1,200 men. Gunpowder, ammunition, and horses were seized and requisitioned. Customs officials were granted new powers to detain anyone who seemed suspicious as they entered or left the Commonwealth. The West Country, a known hotbed for Royalist sympathisers, was swept with troops and many people were arrested. Horse races were suspended for 6 months. They provided a great cover for Royalist sympathisers to gather and discuss their plans. Beyond these preparatory works, evidence of this uprising was also unearthed. An arms smuggler, who had claimed he was sending weapons on to Barbados and Virginia, but who had actually been passing them on to Royalists within the Commonwealth, was arrested, and his collaborators in local authority were discovered too. Strands of the actual uprising itself were uprooted. The leadership of the prospective North Wales uprising were caught, and they sang like canaries to Cromwell personally. Royalist agents, complete with incriminating letters from the exiled Charles, were arrested, as were various Royalist gentry figures, as well as leading levellers like John Wildman. When he was caught, Wildman had on his person an incriminating declaration against the tyrant Oliver Cromwell. The Lord Protector presented both Wildman's declaration as well as the letters from the exiled court to the London Common Council, who were sufficiently spooked and agreed to put Major General Skippon back in charge of a raised militia to defend the capital. In the face of this surge of government activity, and in the certain knowledge that at least some of those arrested would give up information, the leadership of this uprising, those who weren't already in jail, tried to postpone it. They weren't entirely successful getting the word out. Some groups still mustered at the agreed date of the 13th of February. Some of them found government troops waiting for them. A group gathered at Salisbury and was arrested. Others met at symbolic sites like Marston Moor, including levellers and Commonwealth's men. They were arrested too. Agents from the royal court landed at Dover, and were promptly arrested and thrown into the castle. Meanwhile, on the continent, Prince Charles just couldn't resist hoping. He'd been staying in Cologne in the Rhineland, but just in case his followers were successful, he made his way to Middelburg, just across the border from the Netherlands, which, as you may recall, had an agreement with the Protectorate to not house the exiled prince. Through his spies, Thurloe knew exactly where Charles was at all times. The prince's movement closer to the Channel supported the suspicion that a plot was still afoot. But all was quiet for a few weeks, before, on the 8th of March, the massive Royalist uprising erupted. Well, not all those words are strictly accurate. I'll just quote directly from Paul Lay here because he sums it up nicely. The night of the 8th unfolded as many Royalists had warned it would. The knot remained sealed. The Presbyterian faction, including Brown, Waller and Willoughby, failed to show. Those who were to lead the attacks on the southern ports were in custody. Government forces sent south from Scotland secured Hull. Where Cavaliers did gather, it was more farce than show of force. Barely 150 men, 1,500 had been promised, heeded Rochester's call to gather at Marston Moor in preparation for an attack at York. The omens had hardly been good for the Royalists. This was, after all, where they had been forced to abandon the north of England. And the result this time was little different from the events of 11 years before, if somewhat less dramatic. Elsewhere, things went just as badly for the plotters. In Chester, the uprising gave up when they saw the sentries. Not the main garrison, just the sentries on the castle wall. In Shrewsbury, the governor arrested the leading royalist in a preemptive strike and discovered a cache of horses and gunpowder on his estate. At Rufford Abbey, in Nottinghamshire, about 300 veterans of the civil wars gathered, but their leadership didn't, so they just went home. About 80 people mustered near Newcastle, but by midnight they too had wandered off. It would be in the West Country where this uprising would get the furthest, and that isn't saying a huge amount. All the leading royalists in Devon, Somerset and Cornwall had either been arrested or were under close watch, which left Wiltshire and Dorset. Bristol had been reinforced with 2 troops of cavalry, but, to the garrison's surprise, the 8th of March passed without any disturbances at all. But 4 days later, Salisbury was suddenly occupied in the night by rebels who proclaimed Charles II King of England. They were led by a local gentleman, John Penruddock. The original plan had intended to be a rising on the 8th, to match elsewhere in England, and to target the Assize Court at Winchester on that day. But Winchester had just been reinforced, and so the new target became Salisbury, with the plan to strike when the Assize judges were visiting the town 4 days later. So, on the evening of the 11th of March, Penruddock gathered around 100 horsemen and 80 recruits on foot, and they entered Salisbury in the wee hours of the 12th. The rebels quickly gained effective control over the town. Guards were stationed at all the public houses, the jail was broken open, and prisoners recruited into the rising. 2 of the Assize judges and the High Sheriff were arrested in their beds. The rebels demanded that the sheriff, John Dove, proclaim Charles II as king. But this was the wrong person to ask. Dove had been part of the High Court trial of Charles I, and he refused, despite being viciously beaten by the Royalists. Penruddock was very gracious with these notables, assuring the judges they would face no repercussions when the Duke of York, Prince James, soon arrived with 10,000 men, and inviting the beaten and bleeding sheriff to dinner. Then, with his forces now grown to around 400 strong, Penruddock left Salisbury and arrived in nearby Blandford by 8 a.m. Here, too, the local officials refused to proclaim Charles as king despite threats, and so Penruddock did it himself. Meanwhile, Cromwell appointed his brother-in-law, John Desborough, as Major General of the West, and sent him to suppress this uprising. The rebels soon learned that government forces were on the way and sent out calls for support. Penruddock's 400 men mustered at Yeovil to wait for the expected thousands of reinforcements. But no one was coming. The rebels marched west through Dorset, aiming for Cornwall. Their numbers were growing slowly from more freed prisoners and local reinforcements, and they stopped for the night at South Molton on the 14th of March. This was as far as they'd get. A government captain, Unton Croke, led 60 men from Exeter and attacked the encamped rebels. 60 against 400. The superior discipline and experience of the army troops easily won out. After a 2-hour battle, Penruddock and several of his comrades accepted Croke's offer of quarter and surrendered. The rest of the rebel force soon followed suit. Desborough arrived a few days later to find that all that was left was mopping up, and he sent cavalry to hunt down any escapees. Many of them managed to escape, passing by customs officials either disinterested or disinclined to check too closely. The Protectorate dealt with the West Country rebels with a very light touch, considering their goals were the overthrow of the state. Only a third of those captured would face trial, and they didn't face a military tribunal, but a regular trial by jury. Penruddock was able to reject nearly 24 jurors before he was finally satisfied. The vast majority of those imprisoned would be released by December. Others were transported, and of the 38 sentenced to death for treason, only 15 were actually executed. This number, of course, included Penruddock himself, but he and his fellow condemned didn't suffer the traitor's death of hanging, drawing, and quartering. Penruddock left a will before this rising, leaving it with his wife, and judging from its tone, he didn't really expect to succeed. But his loyalty to the House of Stuart was strong, and so he did his part in a design which had already failed everywhere else. Foolish, brave, or both? The trials did pose a legal problem, though. Treason was, after all, an offence against the king, and there was no king. This had been waived before, particularly at the trial of the last king, but the Protectorate's treason ordinance, drawn up before the first Protectorate Parliament met, had not been approved and made law by that Parliament. The Protectorate was on legally shaky ground here, as some lawyers and judges pointed out. The uprising had been effectively suppressed, with barely a shot fired, and this success was in large part due to the efforts of John Thurloe. But Cromwell's spymaster couldn't always bring his friend and sovereign good news. It was through Thurloe that the Protectorate court learned in May 1655 that the Spanish had prepared for an attack by the English. They'd seen the Western design set sail, and reasonably suspected that their colonial empire was its target. So they were ready to punish any English in their realms. Anti-Spanish, but more general anti-Catholic sentiment reached a fever pitch around this point. The settlement of Ireland and the transplantation and transportation of Irish Catholics was reaching its peak, and news from abroad also fanned the flames of sectarianism. The Waldensians were a pre-Reformation sect which had embraced some of the later doctrines. They were a significant minority in the Savoyard province of Vaud. The Catholic Duke of Savoy had grown impatient with these heretics in his lands, and after months of steadily increasing violence against them, he ordered a massacre. Exact numbers are, as always, impossible to measure, but conservative estimates put the number of Waldensians killed in the Piedmont Easter, men, women and children, at nearly 2,000. Other estimates are much higher. The international reaction, even from the Duke's fellow Catholics, was near universal condemnation. Cromwell even threatened to send the state's navy to Nice to intervene militarily. The outrage in the Commonwealth only grew louder when rumours spread that transported Irish had been part of the ducal forces, and of course English pamphleteers attributed the worst excesses to them. If you remember back in episode 316, To Hell or Barbados, Charles Fleetwood used this news to justify harsher measures against Catholics in Ireland. This is all to say that English Protestants were primed to view international events through a religious lens, the true faith versus the Catholic Antichrist, and the results of the Western design absolutely became part of this. Thurloe received plenty of communication from the Western design, not just from the commanders of the military forces, Venables and Penn, but also Edward Winslow. Only 2 of these reports survive, which gives us only a limited idea of how often the old colonist was updating the secretary. Other accounts, both official and personal, such as from letters, were copied for Thurloe's attention. The disaster on Hispaniola was, therefore, known to the Lord Protector by the end of July. The government was quite surprised when they opened the official report from Penn and discovered the Admiral was very quick to brush over their failure to conquer Hispaniola, and then spent the rest of the report gushing about how amazing Jamaica was and how great it was that the design had captured this jewel. The Council of State obviously saw right through this attempt to rewrite the objectives of the design, and it's not a surprise that both Venables and Penn ended up in the Tower on their return. To the Lord Protector, the defeat at Hispaniola was a devastating blow. This was a man who genuinely and sincerely believed that God was on his side, and his career had offered plenty of evidence for that belief. Providence had guided the English to victory over a tyrannical king. Providence had led Cromwell himself to victory after victory, in a near uninterrupted streak of success. God had cast down the House of Stuart and the institution of monarchy, with the godly New Model army as his instrument. God had delivered victory over the perfidious Scots at the Miracle of Dunbar, and followed it with a crowning glory at Worcester exactly a year later. Ireland had been reconquered, its people freed from the machinations of a corrupt priesthood, and prepared to be correctly instructed in the true Protestant faith. The English had weathered the Anglo-Dutch War, defeating the preeminent naval power in the Western Hemisphere. And now, that instrument of God's will, the Protectorate's military machine, had been aimed at the heart of the great Antichrist, Spain. And that instrument had shattered. Providence had been lost. Had God abandoned the English? Had he abandoned Cromwell? Cromwell's reaction to this news was very in character. He led his council in a fast the day after he received Penn's report. This was held in secret, and the ship which had carried Penn's message was locked down. No one was allowed to disembark. The ship was an info hazard. The news it carried was a plague. But of course, someone talked. Someone always talks. Within 2 days of the secret fast, the news sheets, friendly to the government and very likely to have been guided in what to say by Thurloe, began trickle-truthing their readers. One news sheet admitted that the English had been defeated, but that it was a heroic defeat, so it wasn't that bad. Another insisted that actually the English had succeeded, that Hispaniola had been conquered and hundreds of prisoners taken. Another claimed that both Jamaica and Hispaniola had been conquered because they were basically the same, in the way that the Isle of Wight was part of England. In August, Mercurius Politicus, the mouthpiece of Marchemont Needham, and so the mouthpiece of Thurloe, described how the design commanders had changed their minds about Hispaniola, how Jamaica had been easily conquered, and how brilliant it was. The island was so fertile, the weather was great, there was plenty of food, the English definitely weren't dropping like flies, etc., etc. Some of that was true, and the island would, in time, become the most valuable part of England's and then Britain's Caribbean empire, built on the backs of sugar and enslaved labour. But right now, in 1655, Needham was putting the best of our modern spin doctors to shame. War with Spain was a reality once again, but Philip IV didn't rush into a full-blown conflict. He'd only just finished fighting the French, and the States Navy was still a very dangerous enemy in a pitched battle. Instead, the Spanish court announced a trade embargo with England, and privateers operated freely out of Dunkirk and Ostend. Cromwell needed to understand why. Why had God forsaken him and the Commonwealth? And the answer he settled on, after fasting and praying and speaking with his advisers, was obvious to him. God had granted the new model army and Parliament victory over their enemies and control over all three kingdoms in order to do his work. The king, then the rump, then Barebones' Parliament had all been cast down by the Lord, with the army as his instrument, because they had failed to do so. God's favour had now been withdrawn from the Protectorate because it too had failed to carry this out. To quote again from Paul Lay, they had failed in their divinely appointed task of carrying out the moral transformation of the English people. Cromwell wrote to Colonel Richard Fortescue, now commander of the army in Jamaica, that the only way to regain God's blessing is that, quote, all manner of vice may be thoroughly discountenanced and severely punished, and that such a form of government may be exercised that virtue and godliness may receive due encouragement. It was a mission that could be postponed no longer. End quote. Next time, we will see how the Protectorate will try to bring about this moral transformation. If the army had been God's instrument before, then it could be again. So next time, we will welcome the rule of the Major Generals. Thank you to my House of Lords, including the King's favourite, Mike Sanders, the Duke of Newcastle, Jonathan Williams, the Marquis of Ludlow, Nick Robinson, and the Earl of Hillary, John Watson. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica to join their ranks and listen to the podcast without ads. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, you can also access the ad-free feed through the membership there. Pax Britannica is part of the Airwave History Bundle. Remember that you can join the mailing list to get news about the show by going to the link in the description. For other great podcasts on the Airwave Network, check out airwavemedia.com. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.